Welcome to Resourcevol's Adjustments Workflow. The aim of this workflow is to give non-profit organisations a straightforward, consistent and practical process to follow in circumstances where reasonable adjustments may be needed to enable volunteering. A reasonable adjustment is a change made to reduce or remove disadvantages faced within your organisation by volunteers with disabilities, or with physical or mental health conditions, including injuries and ill health. The workflow begins when a volunteer indicates during your organisation's registration process that they may require adjustments to enable their volunteering. In stage 1 of the workflow, the volunteer receives a copy of your organisation's standard volunteer registration confirmation. This should contain a section explaining that a staff member will be in touch if the volunteer has indicated they may require adjustments, and asking them not to attend a volunteering session in the meantime. The relevant volunteer manager should be notified and prompted to contact the volunteer, or their support worker if applicable, as soon as possible, before they attend a volunteering session. In stage 2 of the workflow, the volunteer manager attempts to contact the volunteer. It's good practice to check the volunteer's communication preferences, if provided, before making contact. The volunteer may find it easier to speak on the phone or send short messages rather than writing emails, for example. Be prepared to adapt your approach to suit the volunteer as needed. If the volunteer hasn't indicated a preferred communication method, it's usually best to try calling them in the first instance. Make sure to refer to a standard phone script during the call to help you remember everything you need to say and ask, and always follow up with an email or other written communication as a record of your conversation. No matter how you make contact with the volunteer, be sure to remember these key points. Focus on what is objectively required for the volunteer role, not your personal opinion or assessment of the volunteer or their capabilities. A good approach is to think about what needs to be accomplished within the role, rather than how it is accomplished. There can be nervousness around the difficulty of making adjustments, but most adjustments are straightforward, free, easy, and usually just normal best practice, such as keeping walkways clear for someone with reduced visibility. You don't need to be an expert in all disabilities or physical or mental health conditions and possible adjustments. The volunteer will be the expert in their own condition, so you just need to ask questions and listen to their answers. If you're unsure what adjustments your organisation can or can't make, be honest. Tell the volunteer that you need to check and we'll get back to them. Your organisation should ideally have a reference document with examples of reasonable adjustments and how to implement them. Make sure this is updated every time a new adjustment is made. If your attempt at contacting the volunteer is unsuccessful, send a holding email or other written communication to let them know that you tried to get in touch. Ask them to contact you instead, and remind them that they shouldn't attend a volunteering session in the meantime. If it's possible that the volunteer could go along to a volunteering session anyway, before contacting the volunteer manager, make sure to let all the relevant people know. It's unlikely that the person will be able to volunteer in this situation, but if practical, consider giving them the option to stay and observe the session instead. This will be a useful experience for when they are able to volunteer. In any case, they should be asked to contact the volunteer manager before going along to another volunteering session. It's worth noting that points 3 and 4 also apply if a volunteer doesn't indicate during the registration process that they require adjustments, but this becomes apparent when they go along to a session. Similarly, if a volunteer didn't require adjustments when they initially registered, but their circumstances have changed, for example due to illness or injury. If your attempt at contacting the volunteer is successful, this leads on to stage 3 of the workflow. In stage 3, you'll determine if adjustments are actually required. They may not be required if your organisation's standard working practices already address the potential issues raised, and additional changes are unnecessary. If this is the case, or adjustments are not required for any other reason, send an email or other written communication to the volunteer as formal confirmation and a record of your conversation. Remember to ask them to let you know if their circumstances change at any point in the future, so you can make sure they're able to continue volunteering safely and without interruption. Now you've reached the end of the workflow. Make sure to update your organisation's volunteer management system as required, and log all relevant communication and documents for future reference. If at stage 3 you determine that adjustments are required, Send a holding email or other written communication to the volunteer as formal confirmation and a record of your conversation. Draft a risk assessment for the volunteer to review, so you can both agree on what actions are needed to enable their volunteering. Your organisation should have a template risk assessment and examples to help you with this. Speak to your manager if you need further support. The outcome of your risk assessment will be either negative or positive. For the purposes of equity, inclusivity and diversity, your organisation should always make a concerted effort to work with volunteers and implement reasonable adjustments to enable volunteering. However, making reasonable adjustments for volunteers is usually not a legal requirement for non-profit organisations, and it may be that your organisation is unable to commit to making the identified adjustments. In this case, the risk assessment outcome will be negative. This could be due to several different factors. For example, if the organisation is operating with limited resources and the adjustments would require significant time, effort, or financial investment. If the adjustments could potentially compromise the health and safety or have a negative impact on other volunteers, staff, or the people the organisation serves. If the adjustments would significantly disrupt the organisation's operations or hinder the achievement of its mission. If legal or regulatory constraints prevent the organisation from making the adjustments. If the adjustments are simply infeasible due to the nature of the work or the specific circumstances of the organisation. It's important to note that each situation is unique, and what might be a barrier to implementing adjustments in one context may not be in another. Assessments should always be made on an individual basis. Regardless of the reason, if the risk assessment outcome is negative, you'll need to send a formal update to the volunteer, clearly explaining your organisation's decision with a copy of the final risk assessment for reference. You may also need to update other relevant people. Make sure this is limited to people who actually need to know, and only provide the minimum level of information required in each case. Often it's enough to just state the outcome of the risk assessment, without going into details about the volunteer's situation or the reasoning behind your organisation's decision. It's also a good idea to let the volunteer know what information you'll be sharing, with whom, and why. Now you've reached the end of the workflow. Make sure to update your organisation's volunteer management system as required, and log all relevant communication and documents for future reference. If the risk assessment outcome is positive, this means that it is possible for your organisation to make the identified adjustments. In this case, you'll need to send a formal update to the volunteer, clearly explaining your organisation's decision with a copy of the final risk assessment for reference. You should also create a timeline for implementing the adjustments and get started without delay. You can use the timeline to let the volunteer know when they should be able to start volunteering. You may need to update other relevant people too. Make sure this is limited to people who actually need to know and only provide the minimum level of information required in each case. Remember to let the volunteer know what information you'll be sharing, with whom, and why. Now you've reached the end of the workflow. Make sure to update your organisation's volunteer management system as required, and log all relevant communication and documents for future reference. Thank you for watching this workflow video. For bespoke resources and consultation services, please email hello@resourcevol.com.